As I mentioned in the last session, um, we get to this idea of the celibacy of the priesthood, and a lot of it was started out of the monastic movement, which began as Christianity began to be part of the fabric of the Roman power, as it began to be a legal religion. Many people saw Christianity becoming sadly more corrupt, and this monastic movement began to develop that became very popular, and it was also a really very vibrant expression of renewal and revival at the time. But one of the ideas that came out of that was the celibacy of the priesthood, and and again, the idea eventually became part of the exclusive idea of the celibacy of the priesthood, especially in the West, and it but it not only became the dominant idea, it also helped the Roman Catholic Church economically because celibate priests could not pass their inheritance on to their children. Whatever money or power they gained had to go back to the church, and that helped the church economically, um, for good or for bad. Um, but I want to look at a few reflections of Christendom in the early church era and even modern reflections today. And, you know, not all of these are bad. A lot of these are really, really good reflections of how Christians' influence has expanded throughout our society today. So here's an early painting reflecting the coronation of Charlemagne the Great, being crowned by the Pope at that time. You can notice he's kneeling, but he's almost as tall as the Pope because apparently Charlemagne the Great was about 7 feet tall. Um, but here's another expression of Christendom. One of the most beautiful structures in Rome, St. Peter's Cathedral. Um, you also see this beautiful church here in France, the Cathedral of Clermont. You see the Cathedral of Notre Dame. If any of you have been there, you know it took over 200 years to build that church. It's a magnificent structure. Um, you also see in Christendom some politics that creep into the art. You see Rosselli's crossing of the Red Sea, and the Egyptians that are trying to cross in the Red Sea and that are drowned. Among them, you see some of the political, modern, at least medieval, enemies of Rosselli at that time. So politics crept into their Christendom. Another example is Privatelli's submission of Pharaoh in the Red Sea. Again, among Pharaoh's army, you see the enemies of Privatelli. Among Moses and his followers, you see the allies and friends and even their national flags of Privatelli. Again, here's another example here, the Christianization of Poland. But in that Christianization, you see the flag of Poland and you see some political ramifications there. Um, Here's another modern portrayal of Christendom. And what you find different in this painting is you see Jesus here, but you see him apparently among some people that look Native American or Mayan. And what this is it's a Mormon portrayal of Jesus supposedly visiting North American and the quote the lost tribe of Israel that theoretically came to North America at that time. Um, what this does is it reflects what we call a uh, how Christianity and politics create whole new narratives that are not really part of the original gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's really what Mormonism early on tried to do. Is it tried to how do I say it? It tried to introduce the United States into the gospel narrative by creating this whole fabrication of history that Jesus came to America and visited America, shortly before his ascension to the Father. Um, but here you see other aspects of Christendom that are much more positive. Christians really were the ones who introduced the very first hospitals in the world. Really, places where people cared for the ill. And of course, we see hospitals all over the world today. Those were largely, the majority of them were started by Christians, and you still see some aspects of that. Certainly today in my community, I see St. Vincent's Hospital started by Christians. You still have nuns there. We have an Adventist hospital started by Christian Adventists here, and a variety of other hospitals with Christian names founded by Christians. But we also see Christians that started what we call the modern university system. Among those in the medieval area, one of the earliest universities started in France was the Sorbonne University. Um, Another thing that Christians introduced to modern society was the idea of hospitality. So Christians in the medieval era were the ones who introduced, they were the hospitaliers, the ones that provided shelter to those people visiting a community. And so were the ones that originally created what we call modern day hotels. Um, what happened in renewal Christianity during the medieval era? I should certainly mention the early monastic movement, which I already mentioned briefly, um, and how it began to spread and become popularized at that time. But we also see in renewal Christianity at this time several leaders, Gregory the Great, that I already mentioned, the Venerable Bede, who emphasized that the Holy Spirit and the gifts of the Holy Spirit were for all people, which is very, very important. And then you see Maximus the Confessor in the East, who emphasized the role of the Holy Spirit and the baptism of the Holy Spirit that later in the medieval period becomes most emphasized in Simeon, the new theologian, which we'll talk about probably next week. But we also see Cyril and Methodius that were asked to go to beyond the extent of the Roman Empire and introduce Christianity to the Slavic peoples. Early in this era, at the end of the 8th century and even into the 9th century, they began to introduce Christianity into Bulgaria and even into Russia, and spread Christianity far beyond the borders of what was then known as even the Holy Roman Empire, or what was formerly the Roman Empire and beyond. So Christianity continued to expand and grow and bring spiritual renewal in places that had never previously known Christianity. Well, I look forward to your discussion this week, and I look forward to our live lecture as well. So we'll talk to you, and then of course next week we'll look further at the medieval period in its height. And see you next week. Bye now.